So if we were to zoom out all the way, we've zoomed out at each individual 6 urge. So like we've kind of explained the spirit of each individual one. And I want to look at all of them as one system that we call Ethereum. Post urges, once all of the urges are now what we just call Ethereum. What is Ethereum? What is the end game? What does Ethereum look like when all of these things are complete? How do we think of this system?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just call back to Vitalik's original Endgame post, which he wrote in December of 2021. So I think it was right before he came on Bankless the first time. He summarized it with a very simple diagram that said, you're going to have centralized block production, decentralized block validation, and strong censorship resistance. Like, if that's the thing that we're building towards, I think we're going in the right direction.
So I have the diagram that Mike just mentioned up from Vitalik's original post, and we'll include a link to that post. It was called Endgame, actually. So same title as this episode, an episode that preceded it in 2022. So this diagram itself is pretty significant because I think what it's pointing to, Dom, is all of the different approaches to scaling a blockchain are all converging into this single box, which is centralized production, decentralized validation, strong anti-censorship protection. There's some sort of notion of convergence, I think, in the end game here. What do you think this is? Why is this significant for Ethereum and kind of the roadmap that we just went through?
I think it just means that no matter what we do, we end up at this end game. So the approach that Ethereum takes with rollups it's very pragmatic, as in it's much easier to introduce blob space and scale it and then let rollups innovate on top of it, rather than trying to scale layer 1 all by ourselves, which was like the roadmap before rollups came about. And it's all these urges just tied together beautifully. Like, you have blob space innovation on rollups, and then ZK EVMs on the rollups, and then you enshrine that onto layer 1, and it all comes together for very, very easy validation of the chain, even though there's a centralized block building, but they're constrained so that we keep this censorship resistance.
And that's true for Ethereum, even if like there becomes one super rollup that scales and dominates everything, or if we are more like the world that we're in right now, where there's many different rollups that are flourishing, and there's kind of like this fragmentation, but we've got some cross chain kind of like bridging. If either of those paths come true, then we sort of end up at this end game, and Ethereum is just accelerating towards that. Is that right?
Yes, it's exactly right. So of course, if we mean one rollup, it sounds scary if you think of rollups today with multi-sigs and bridges and upgradability. But like in the end game, even if you have one rollup and that rollup is like fully mature, no training wheels, that rollup itself has like censorship resistance guarantees from layer 1. Then if we end up at a world with a single rollup, then that's basically that rollup is effectively Ethereum's execution layer, like somewhat indirectly, but also it has the same trust assumptions and everything. So we end up at this end game anyway. But with many rollups, you can see that they compete with each other in order to squeeze the most value out of Ethereum blob space. So if the one rollup starts slacking and charging too much compared to what blob space actually costs, and you can have like competition, another rollup takes the market share, and we still end up at that end game, which is Vitalik's
because
point.
The thing that Ethereum is really prioritizing is censorship resistance, right? That censorship resistance, decentralization, that armor at kind of the base level. And I guess if you're approaching it from another vantage point, which I think in his diagram, he talks about the traditional big block chains. So these are chains that have not prioritized their roadmap for censorship resistance. In order to get to that end game, that end state that Ethereum is marching towards, they will have to go back and add that, won't they? They'll have to go back and add all of the anti-fraud types of mechanisms. They'll have to go figure out how to slay the MEV monster, or at least tame it, as we said through this episode. They'll have to figure out how to do the inclusion lists and encrypted mempools and add all of that censorship resistance armor. And there's still a path for them to do it. It's just like, wow, that's hard. You have to effectively do all of the stuff that Ethereum is kind of doing in its roadmap today. Is that the point?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, obviously super biased, but I feel like we're almost taking the easier path, right? Because it seems very like the fact that Ethereum already has this credible neutrality, this great base layer community that's running solo staking. We have client diversity. Like starting from there and kind of scaling the technology kind of horizontally first and then vertically feels much easier than scaling it vertically and then trying to go horizontal, right? Because now to go horizontal, you have to convince solo stakers to run nodes in many jurisdictions. You have to introduce like latency into this block production pipeline to allow people to communicate across the globe. Like the path of least resistance feels like the one that we're taking.
It's easy. And I guess in another way, the approach is easier to start decentralized, right? Than to start centralized and become more decentralized. It's just like a little bit of hard mode here.
Yeah, you're kind of fighting Moloch, right?
Yeah, right. I want to ask you guys the question as you zoom out, you look at this roadmap, like just maybe a general question. What can go wrong here? Right? Like as you think about actually implementing the full vision here, I'm sure there's some dragons hidden in that diagram on the wallpaper of your phone screen, Mike. Where are they? Yeah. Like if something goes
3
wrong,
years ago,
where?
we didn't know that the Scourge was in the roadmap, but the Scourge was in the roadmap whether we knew it or not.
Yeah. Is there maybe an unknown unknowns category, of course, but like, yeah, what about the things that you know that you think could be thorny?
Yeah, I think not addressing kind of when I mentioned earlier these kind of key centralization choke points of MEV, restaking, liquid staking, I think that could get into a situation that's very hard to get out of, right? Like, for example, that whole 100% ETH staked, all of it through a single governance token, that governance token being controlled by a small minority of people would be like a very difficult place to get out of. I think there's also just this kind of continual push and pull in terms of ossification versus like trying to ship all this cool, exciting new tech, right? And there's almost some natural amount of ossification happening just because coordination gets really hard as you scale out, right? Like the ecosystem is growing. Like I just mentioned Moloch, but there's all of these like human coordination problems that seem to arise. And especially as everyone has kind of their own vested interest, the financial side starts to like creep in. So you have this almost weird thing where, you know, how in US Congress, like nothing gets done because everyone has essentially like solidified in their views and no one can come to consensus on what the right path forward is. I don't think we're going to ossify through lack of execution. That seems like a really bad outcome. But if we get to a point where the important themes of the roadmap aren't prioritized and aren't shipped within like the right time frame, it could almost become like the governance process is just stagnant and no longer able to like deliver what Ethereum consumers need, which is like L2 scaling roadmap, cheap transaction fees on the L2, and great censorship resistance on the L1.
What about you, Dom? If something goes wrong, what do you think it's going to be?
I think the key theme of something going wrong in any of these pieces is that we always have fallbacks. Like a good example is finality. If it for some reason too many validators are offline, then we have the inactivity leak. We're still producing blocks for people to use the blockchain. It's still live, just not finalized just yet. So that's one fallback. And if we have EPPS and then for some reason all the builders just go out of business and they no longer proposing blocks, then we fall back to what we have today with locally built blocks and things like that. There's fallbacks everywhere. So sure, there are some unknown unknowns, but I think overall, everyone's like super aligned to have a strong Ethereum, including the social layer, which is the ultimate fallback if something goes catastrophic. Things like client diversity is super important to address at the social layer because that's another fallback. If one client has a bug, then other clients can just pick up the slack. So you can see that the resilience of Ethereum is just in all these fallbacks, and the modular version of doing all these modular parts and coming together. It's like I said earlier, it's beautiful and there's fallbacks everywhere.
Defense in depth. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting because as we've, like one of the early Bankless principles is there's a difference between the network and the asset when you're looking at a blockchain system. So there's Ethereum, the network, and there's Ether, the asset. A lot of people confuse those things, and because in Bitcoin, the asset and the network are both called Bitcoin. I like to say Ether whenever possible, although a lot of people use Ethereum pretty synonymously, and I've capitulated on some of that. But I think in this entire conversation, we've been talking mostly about Ethereum, the network. That's very interesting because when you bring on strong Bitcoiners, there's very little talk about the network. Maybe now more increasingly with ordinals and things like that, but it's mostly about Bitcoin, the asset itself. And I want to ask you guys this because the focus has been on Ethereum, the network, this entire episode. And we've talked about this computer that we're all building out in the open collectively. And there's all these groups like coming together to pitch in, and some of the smartest minds on the internet in the world at this time. And this exciting project, and we're all doing it together, right? It's very collaborative, and we're building this censorship resistance blockchain network computer. And at the end of that, I'm wondering what that means for Ether, the asset. And I kind of want your personal takes here, right? So like, Mike, do you think that this is what we're building here is kind of like a monetary unit? I mean, David and our take here is like, what we're actually building is a censorship resistant form of money. That's kind of the byproduct of the network that we're building. It's kind of like, part of the same thing. If we build the network, then we get the asset. And if the asset's strong, then we get like stronger properties in the network. It's like this flywheel. What's your take on that? At the end of this, when the Ethereum roadmap is complete, when we've reached the end game, what about Ether, the asset? What does that look like?
I really like the analogy of thinking of Ether as the digital oil, right? It's kind of this important commodity on in the future of the internet. It's useful for paying gas. People use it to buy things. They price, NFTs in it. It also is kind of this decentralized store of value, right? It does have that moneyness property where, across border payments are just like seamless. All you have to do is know someone's address. Like, I do think a lot of the moneyness properties of Ether, the asset, are just fully solidified by having that kind of foundational network security, network censorship resistance. And yeah, kind of just like drawing back to the kind of Canadian strike that I mentioned earlier. I think, yeah, like it all comes back to property rights. And if there's no one that can exert any control over the network, then the property rights are maximally strong and maximally permissionless. And I think the value of the Ether token is just downstream of that, honestly.
What's your take on the same question, Dom?
I think the flywheel effect you mentioned is another beautiful aspect of Ethereum, where Ethereum, the network, helps Ether the asset, and Ether the asset helps Ethereum the network, because there's like this feedback loop between all the different crypto economic elements, like having to pay ETH for gas, which gives some demand for ETH, but also using ETH as the only trustless money across the whole ecosystem with rollups and everything. Like, that's the one permissionless asset that has no off-chain dependencies. And all these equilibriums just come together where it stays secure by having ETH, the asset, used as collateral for staking in pretty secure Ethereum, the blockchain. And then there's the equilibrium of staking yield that goes down if too many validators exit, so more validators come in to replace them. So it's all these flywheel effects are super cool to see in the Ethereum as an asset and as a network.
So this high-level roadmap, this is not months, this is definitely a years type thing. Want to ask you, to get to the end of everything we've talked about today, are we talking about a longer time period? Are we talking about decades? Or are we still in years? I mean, do you think we can get this whole thing wrapped up in like 5 years, or will this take longer?
I think there's a very long tail. Like, all of this kind of super futuristic cryptography especially feels extremely unknown unknowns in terms of time horizons. But I do genuinely think, especially when I was talking about like kind of ossification through coordination, in the next like 5 to 7 years, I do feel like a majority of the big questions about Ethereum should have been answered and should have been enshrined into the protocol, because these things are very slow to evolve, right? Like, the internet protocol has barely evolved since it was, enshrined in the early days. I I think USB is another really good example of something that was like super sticky, like this protocol, which is like the protocol is defined by the hardware spec, right? And that's also extremely sticky because by the time that something gains like real value and real product market fit, real adoption, it can't afford to change very much. So I hope that like we get to the point where Dom and I don't even have to be employed by the EF anymore. You know, we're doing our thing somewhere else. The network is boring. The all core devs, nothing happens because there's no change. You know, I think that getting to that state quickly is pretty important too.
To continue leveling up your crypto game, then you need to get on the Bankless newsletter. It's the world's most popular crypto email and is completely free. Just click below to sign up.